just found out something astounding. Approximately 63% of those of you listening to or watching Mayim Bialik's Breakdown are not subscribed. We know you're listening and we know you're watching because of all of the awesome comments you leave telling us how Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is helping you lead a happier and healthier life. We love that. But the best way to support our show is to subscribe. It's also the only way to get latest updates and to know when new episodes drop. So anywhere that you listen to podcasts and on YouTube, please subscribe, hit the bell icon so that you know when a new episode drops. Thank you so much, and on to the episode. Hi, I'm Mayim Bialik.
I'm Jonathan Cohen.
Welcome to our Breakdown. This is the place where we break things down so you don't have to. I'm a little bit speechless as we head into this episode because this is a very different kind of episode than a lot of episodes that we do. I'd say it's the only one of its kind that you will ever hear on Mayim Bialik's Breakdown. We're speaking today with Luis Elizondo. He's the author of Imminent, which debuted #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. He's the former head of the Department of Defense's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. That was his job. He started working at the Pentagon in 2008 after a career in the military. And one day he got a knock on his door from two people in suits who recruited him to work for the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. He didn't know anything about it. He was specifically recruited because he didn't have any particular leaning towards the things that this program explored. And what Luis came to discover was that he was being recruited to be part of a government organization that specifically was designed to keep information from the American public about UFOs and UAPs, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon. And before you say, gosh, Mayim and Jonathan have gone off the deep end and you're having a conspiracy theorist on, I would like you to know that he resigned as one of the most open secrets in the history of the Pentagon because he believed he was sitting on humanity's biggest secret that was being kept from the American people. He is a whistleblower. He wrote a book called Imminent: Inside the Pentagon's Hunt for UFOs. What Luis experienced was being called crazy, having his credibility challenged, having his family threatened. And I'm going to give you the end of the story because I think it's the only thing that might make some of you listen. In 2023, the UAP Disclosure Act was signed, where Congress has to approve taxpayer money being used for UAP research that we didn't know about. And the National Archives have to collect government documents about unidentified anomalous phenomena, technologies of unknown origin, and non-human intelligence. This is real. Lou is a real person. The things that he discusses are about aliens, but they're more about technologies that we simply don't understand and which the government has known about and has been keeping from us. And his whistleblowing allowed us to read this book, understand it. He continues to do work in this arena. And Jonathan and I are going to get into every aspect that we can of how he came to believe, what he believes, what it means for our place in the universe, and why it matters as an act of patriotism to speak up about this. And we are so honored to be able to give him a platform to do so. Luis Elizondo, welcome to The Breakdown.
It is a sincere honor and privilege to be with you today.
You said you have a funny story. Is it for all of our ears before we get started?
Okay, so back in the mid-'90s, I was attending the University of Miami, and like a lot of starving college students, I worked various odd jobs, and one of my jobs was working as a bouncer in Miami at various nightclubs. And there was one in particular. It was if you were into goth and your fair dosage of depression, it was one of those hardcore industrial nightclubs. And once in a while, we'd get some VIPs coming in.
Lou, did I have sex with you in the 90s? Is that where this is heading?
No, actually, on the contrary, you almost got me fired. But here's what happened. Yeah, true story. And I don't know. So hear me out, because you're the only one that can confirm or deny this. But I'm telling you what actually happened, and then it's up to you to decide if you want to, if that was you or not. So once in a while, we'd get these VIPs that would come into the club, and the managers would say, "Hey, look, let's take care of the VIPs." So he comes up to me one evening in the office, says, "Hey, Lou, we have a VIP. Go downstairs and go make sure Awesome is taken care of." Now, Awesome, we had a a local Cuban kid that was a rapper in the local area that had called himself Awesome. So I went downstairs and I'm looking in the club, and I don't see my Cuban friend. And so I'm looking and looking. 10 minutes go by. I go back up and I said, "Hey, boss, I don't see Awesome." He said, "Awesome." I said, "Well, that's what you say." He said, "No, I said Blossom." So I said, "Oh, okay." So I go run downstairs again, and I'm looking around, and I didn't have the guts to go up and talk to my boss. I'm like, "Okay, I got to find this person named Blossom." I'm looking around. I'm like, Jesus Christ, I don't know. So I go back upstairs to my manager again. This time with my tail really between my legs. I'm like, "Look, boss, I don't know who Blossom is." And he says, "You know the TV show Blossom." And I said, "Boss, I'm poor as hell. This is why I work here. I don't own a TV. I don't know who Blossom is." So he thought. So I ran back downstairs. He explained me, and by that time, the other bouncers had said you had left. Now, I could not confirm
Okay.
if that was you who actually went to the club. I can give you the name of the club.
Okay, hold on. I got a couple things here. What city was this?
Miami.
So
it was in Miami.
I have family in Miami. And
okay.
I was in Miami in my teen years. My cousin Abby, who now lives in Israel, my cousin Abby and like my family lives in Miami. So that's the first thing.
Okay.
The second thing is I used to go to goth clubs. Like that was my thing. There was one on Highland and Willoughby, if anyone's paying attention, all you Southern California folks. I used to go to goth clubs as a teenager because I was not awesome. I was Blossom. And a lot of clubs, like the scene was like pickup, and, especially places where teenagers were allowed in. It was like kind of weird. I didn't want to interact with anybody. I wanted to dance by myself to The Cure and Dead Can Dance in a corner where everyone is sad. That's why I would go to goth clubs, because it was very anonymous and it was a very welcoming and, kind of very nice community for kids who were misfits. Like back then, it wasn't cool to be a misfit. It was just like, can you find your people? And I found them in goth clubs.
So the club has been shut down, but it was called Mars Bar, and it was at the end of Kendall, at the very end of Kendall Avenue. And that was my first introduction to you. And you had left by the time I actually went down to actually do the job that they hired me to do. You had gone. You had split. So yeah, I almost got fired, and that is a true story. Whether or not you were actually there, I can't confirm. I don't know.
I don't remember because most of my brain has been taken up with music lyrics and scripts from Blossom and The Big Bang Theory. But what I can confirm, and this is obviously will lead right into what we want to talk to you about. If there's a couple pieces of corroborating evidence that are pointing someone in the right direction, Miami, goth club, and me being a teenager, it's feeling like this probably is true.
Okay.
I don't want to throw Mayim under the bus, but I would say that in the progression of this podcast, we've had the opportunity to speak to some people that start to pull back the curtain on what life is really like behind the scenes, and that we have started to learn with some encouragement by me, but she's been hesitant to start to see the other side of how the world operates. And as we've been inching more towards that, whether it's the industrial food complex or seeing the incentive structures of technology companies or seeing the medical industrial complex, I can go on and on. We came to your work, which is potentially one of the biggest areas where there's maybe another side to the story that people haven't been told yet. And now here we are today.
I'm a skeptic. And I read through every single page of your book. I poured through it like I was analyzing a thesis, like I did not skip. And first of all, it's a beautifully written book because it takes us on the journey, not just of your work at the Pentagon, but your journey as a human being, because it's all kind of related. And, your story, you have this like badass dad, this badass Cuban dad who kind of raised you to be tough, to learn to protect yourself, to learn to be vigilant, skeptical, critical, like really, really an upright, kind of tough guy. And your mom, who you said she had Ashkenazi Jewish in her, also Cherokee, French, Lebanese, this really interesting couple raised you. And your mom was very, very loving and very compassionate. Sounds like a very creative person, very kind of emotionally sensitive person. You joined ROTC, First Junior ROTC, and you sort of turned to a career in the military as one of the only options that you saw is kind of how you described it, that, kids who came from money had different trajectories. But, you grew up, as this person who had to really defend themselves and protect themselves. And you served this country. Thank you for your service also.
Oh, no. Listen, my privilege, my honor.
I mean, but you've been in some of the most complicated, violent, painful places on this planet. And, you tell this story, and I want you to sort of walk us through, you paint a very like X-Files moment of like, you're sitting in your office, you're kind of a career, right? Your career military transitioned you to another aspect. I want you to talk about the day that two people showed up in your office while you were having your morning coffee.
If I can, on the backdrop of, who am I? Who's Lou Elizondo? And the reality is after, after high school, I went into college. I studied the sciences. I went to school to be a microbiologist and immunologist with a specific emphasis on parasitology, not parapsychology, the study of parasites, microorganisms. So I've always been very much a disciple of the scientific principles and scientific methodologies. Was always interested in science as a kid as well. Had some really good teachers when I was younger that during my formative years really kind of inspired me towards science. And then later on, in the military, I was in military intelligence and then became a counterintelligence special agent, an investigator, where primarily our focus was on capital crimes, including subversion, espionage, and terrorism. And so I've always considered myself just a facts man kind of guy. Let the data speak for itself. I'm not really interested in opinions or innuendos or supposition. I'm very, very data driven. I've always been that way. And it served me quite well, actually, in combat theaters and more at the strategic level of intelligence. And in 2008, I had spent a lifelong career all over the world chasing bad guys. And at the time, I was with an organization called the Director of National Intelligence. It's kind of the head honcho, if you will, of the intelligence community. After 9/11, the government realized that we had a problem, that the CIA, the FBI, the DOD, they weren't sharing information with each other, that had they have done a better job, we might have been able to avoid the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So a lot of lessons learned. And so I was working there. And unfortunately, where I lived at the time was to raise a family was on a little island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. So my commute to work was mostly about 3 hours one way. So if you put that in the context of an 8-hour workday, there were some days I was spending more time in the car than I was at work. It was a very long commute. You go through DC and then over by Langley and past the agency and then you finally get to where you got to be. And so in 2008, I was given an opportunity to come back to the Pentagon for a period of time and begin a new program where we would share national level intelligence information with the state and local and tribal law enforcement authorities and try to figure out how do we take super classified information and distill it down to the people who need it, yet with people who don't have security clearances. So that was my job. So in 2008, I took that opportunity, came to the Pentagon, and shortly thereafter, I was approached by two individuals. And these people didn't tell me who they were, but they had the same color badge I had. So I knew that they were in the intelligence community, had at least the same commensurate level of security clearance that I did. So we could talk. And I also worked in a SCIF in a classified area. So they came in and they started talking with me, small talk. One of them in particular, I felt was trying to assess me. They were very, very observant, typical of what you'd expect an intelligence collection officer to do, right? Looking at your body language and neurolinguistics and things like that. And after about 3 or 4 of these meetings, maybe 5, they said, "Hey, look, we'd like you to meet our boss." And I said, "Sure, no sweat." So I'll go to the location, and I went to this undisclosed location right outside of Washington D.C. on the other side of the river. In my book, I say where it is, but the Pentagon asked me to remove that data, that information. So unfortunately, I can't say exactly where it was. But it was a covered facility for the Department of Defense. And I met in this building what you'd say the epitome of a rocket scientist is. His name was Dr. Jim Lukatsky, exceedingly intelligent, brilliant, perhaps the best rocket scientist we had in the U.S. government. This is a gentleman who could tell you the consumption rate of a first stage solid rocket motor booster, or the reentry velocity of a MIRV, right, coming in from low Earth orbit. I mean, really the best of the best, the perfect kind of guy you'd want doing a job in aerospace. And so he finally, after some small talk, he looked at me and he said, "Let me ask you a question." I said, "Yeah, sure." He said, "What do you think of UFOs?" And I thought for a second, and I answered him truthfully. And I said, I don't." And he said, "Well, what do you mean you don't believe in them?" And I said, "No, that's not what I said. You asked me what do I think about them, and the answer is I don't. Frankly, I don't have time. I don't have the luxury to think about them. I'm too busy, doing all this other work. I never really considered it. I wasn't particularly interested as a kid in science fiction. I wasn't, that wasn't me." And he said, "Well, that's fair." Looked over his glasses, and he said, "But let me just warn you: don't let your analytic bias get the best of you, because what you may learn may challenge any preconceived notions or narratives you may think."
Hold on 1 second. Hold on. Did you in that moment feel like this dude is trying to tell me that the government knows that aliens exist? Like, did that occur to you?
I didn't know what to think, because I wasn't sure if he was testing me. Is he trying to determine, am I psychologically unstable? Am I, prone to flights of fancy? You never really know. So in those particular cases, the best thing to do is just be truthful. Just be honest, right? And look at whether he's testing me or not. Here's the answer. I found it a little strange. Long story short, that was really the beginning of a very long and very eye-opening journey into the world of government involvement in the topic of UAP, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon. It's several names have changed over the years, but in the vernacular, we call them UFOs.
The introduction to your book says this: unidentified craft with beyond next generation technology, moving in ways that defy our knowledge of physics, operate with, and this is a direct quote, complete impunity since at least World War II. These craft are not made by humans, and this is a serious national security issue for which you have given your life, put your own family and your safety at risk to be able to share with the American public as what you believe is a service. That's just the first 2 pages of your book. This is astounding, Lou, that we're about to talk about the possibility, like the real possibility, that there is information that has categorically been kept from people. I want you to start there. Why is this information kept from people? And I have my own reasons why I think, but
Sure.
Why do you think? What's your understanding?
I can tell you from 2 perspectives. One is wearing, my former government hat. There's some very practical reasons, and then there are some more perhaps personal and even esoteric reasons. Let's look at this from a functional perspective and the government. So when we really started noticing a lot of these UAP was right on the heels of World War II. They started with the observations of Foo Fighters, or these luminous balls of light that would seem to surveil and shadow our Allied aircraft and even Axis aircraft. Shortly thereafter, what happened? We entered the atomic age, right? And that's really when we started beginning to see a lot of UAP activity in and around sensitive military installations.
Not a coincidence. Not a coincidence.
Not a coincidence at all.
Like that's an important part of this, that a lot of this activity is happening around very specific locations. So, sorry, go on.
Right. And this is why was a national security issue and has been for several decades. And there's been many UFO programs by the U.S. government. Some know of Project Blue Book and the Condon Report and whatnot. But my program was nothing new. It was just a continuation of a long-standing effort by the U.S. government to study UAP, UFOs, and try to figure out how they work. And so, back to your question, why would we as a nation keep this secret for so long? Well, let's look at the backdrop of the Cold War. You had an environment, a strategic environment, where the United States and then Soviet Union were in this winner-takes-all Cold War, which, by the way, wasn't really cold. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's pretty hot. We were involved in a lot of proxy wars, and a lot of things going on at the time. Imagine playing this chessboard, the three-dimensional chess against an enemy. And that's what was happening. And oh, by the way, they happen to have nukes, and so did we. So the folks at the Pentagon, the generals look and they say, okay, we have this real threat over here. These folks over here have nukes, and we are engaged in trying to control the map here. Meanwhile, we got these other things. They're not really a threat yet. They're interested in what we're doing. There's not a whole lot we can do about it. So why don't we focus on the real threat right now, which is Russia, which is then Soviet Union, CCCP. So that was one of the mindsets. Then you had the other issue, a little bit more pragmatic, that all organizations and institutions, especially governments and even religions, they only work because people have faith and confidence in those organizations, right? And governments are designed to be solution oriented. So when you have a problem for which there is no solution, and there's not really a darn thing we can do about it, that's a really uncomfortable conversation to have with the American people, right? And so the other part of that is maybe we should try to figure out this a little bit more before we decide to have the conversation. Now, the problem with that is there's two lines of thinking on secrecy. Some people in the government believe secrets are like fine wine, and the longer you keep a cork on it, the better it gets. Other people, like me, feel that secrets are perishable. They have a shelf life. They're like vegetables in your refrigerator. And there comes a point where if you leave them there too long, they begin to rot, they begin to stink, and you got a bigger mess on your hands, right? They outlive the very reason why they were being classified. And I think that is where we are today. It's to the point where the UAP topic is almost the worst kept secret in the U.S. government. It's pervasive. And like you said, there's really not a whole lot we can do about it. And it is a national security issue. Now, I don't want to say a national security threat, because that's different. I'm not ringing the alarm bells and saying, the British are coming, or the British are coming. In this case, the NHI are coming, or the flying saucers are coming. What I'm simply saying is it's a national security issue, because in order to determine, if I'm wearing my national security hat, if something is a threat, there's really a very simple calculus, and that is capabilities versus intent. Now, we've seen a lot of the capabilities, and this goes to your original statement a couple minutes ago about these capabilities. We still have no idea the intent. And so it is impossible to make a determination from a national security perspective, is this or is this not a threat? And so we have to assume in the government it could be until we're sure it's not.
You mentioned in the mid 70s, right, was when some of the kind of documentation that we now know exists. This is not me and Lou making it up, like over martinis, right, at a goth club. This is information that we now know exists. So Robert Pratt was one of the people who was able to interview some of these people, and we have the records, right, of what was reported. There were these orbs that would sort of chase people, for lack of a better word, hover, and the kind of things. And he interviewed people, and they had evidence of laser burns. They had these, kind of very common and similar reports of abductions. People were left catatonic. And people also were describing what we now call Nordics and Greys, these two types of beings that people kept reporting. And this is a time before cell phones, before people can WhatsApp what they think is happening or tweet it out. These are isolated reports from all over the world. Can you explain what these early interviews were revealing?
Sure. Well, it even goes beyond that. To be honest with you, there is official U.S. government documentation that has been released that was very classified at one point, that has now been released to the public through the Freedom of Information Act process. And they're there for anybody to see. So we could say, oh, somebody interviewed something, somebody saw something. But keep in mind, my focus when I was working for the Pentagon, I wasn't interested in grandma seeing some lights in the backyard. We were looking at telemetry data. We were looking at electro-optical data. We were looking at real data coming in from some of the most sophisticated collection sensor systems on the planet. So you had, for example, F-18 Super Hornet Top Gun pilots that are trained observers that can recognize the silhouette between an Su-22, a MiG-25, and an F-16 from 10 miles away and identify friend or foe and make a decision in a split second to shoot it. That was further being backed up by gun camera footage and FLIR footage, forward-looking infrared footage. And that was being backed up by radar data, both airborne radar, seaborne, and ground-based radar systems. So you've got, this is more than just someone saying something or hearing a story. You have three, if not four or five different collection systems, all reporting the same information at the same time, at the same place, under the same circumstances. Now, remember, my background is that of a special agent. If I went to court with this, the jury would have no choice but to convict. We are well beyond reasonable doubt. And this goes back, this type of information, not just decades, but in some cases, potentially millennia. And I think that for me is so striking because there are historical records, official historical records from other governments and other religions that talk about these strange encounters. There is one, for example, in Rome. There's a communication between a Roman soldier and a Roman general where they describe what they call eclipus. Eclipus in Latin means, well, think of eclipse, right? The shape of the sun, which happened to be the shape of the Roman shields. They call them eclipus. And they were describing these flaming Roman shields in the sky that was following them from battle space to battle space. And that's just one small example of historical documentation that is describing something, some phenomena in the air. Now, this is before radar and FLIR and F-18s and F-22s, but we're well beyond that now. Now we have a lot of fidelity to illustrate what these things can actually do and how they can outperform anything we have in our inventory. And like you said, they can be encountered without impunity over our most sensitive military installations and our controlled U.S. airspace globally.
So let's talk about. I was really fascinated to learn about this Wilson Davis memo, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what the Wilson Davis memo was, and specifically, like Roswell, New Mexico. For many of us, we grew up as like that's the biggest joke and the biggest hoax around. Something happened in Roswell, New Mexico that the government knew about. Lou, help me here.
Sure. Well, two-part question. Let's start with Admiral Wilson. Admiral Wilson was a senior official in the Department of Defense.
When was this? Just give us a time frame.
So we're probably talking right now. It was before my time. The Wilson Davis memos was a conversation between supposedly Eric Davis, who was a scientist at the time, had worked for the U.S. government, top secret security clearances, worked for several of the three-letter agencies, and it was a debriefing that allegedly, and I want to say this very carefully, allegedly, because it has been entered into the official records of Congress as being a legitimate document. However, one of the individuals that was participant in this alleged situation denies it ever occurred, this meeting. But several other people say, I was there and it actually did occur. And there's a reason why I can explain why somebody may want to say, it didn't occur, I wasn't there. And there's a legal reason for that. But let's go back to the Wilson Davis memo. Someone had approached Admiral Wilson and said, listen, there is this program that you probably want to get briefed to that's spending a lot of U.S. government money. And so Admiral Wilson goes and he says, okay, let me figure this out. And he said, by the way, it's about UFOs, it's about crash retrievals, and it's about reverse engineering, what the U.S. government actually knows about UFOs. And at the time, Admiral Wilson really had controlled a lot of the black budgets for the U.S. government. Black budgets are the hidden budgets within the budgetary system of our government, especially for military and intelligence systems and whatnot. And he said, I haven't been briefed to this. So he goes and he makes a couple inquiries. And finally, someone says, we have a program, but we're not going to read you onto the program. And so Admiral Wilson says, well, let me rephrase myself. I don't think you understand. I'm Admiral Wilson. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, right? And with a couple more stiff arms, finally, Admiral Wilson succeeded in having a meeting, apparently, with the program managers. And the program managers basically said, with all due respect, dear Admiral, yes, we have a UFO program. No, we're not going to read you onto it, and stop asking about it. So at this point, Admiral Wilson gets very upset. He goes back to the Pentagon, makes a few calls, and someone in leadership said, basically, look, unless you want to lose a few stars and be forced to retire, I wouldn't ask any more questions. So then that led to a debriefing with then Dr. Eric Davis, incredibly brilliant mind.
And he was an astrophysicist, correct?
He is absolutely. It's an astrophysicist, still is. And by the way, has worked on some of America's most sensitive programs. And so he had this debriefing and wrote up a memorandum, and that memorandum went to, I believe it was astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was also very much historically involved in the UAP. He actually had his own alleged UAP encounter while in space.
He was the sixth man to walk on the moon. He was part of Apollo 14,
Correct.
Edgar Mitchell. This is
That's
not
right.
just like Joe Schmo off the street. This is a person who has gone through the kind of testing, psychological battery, like rigorous training to be a legit astronaut who is part of this conversation.
Correct. In fact, wants full transparency because he had his own encounter while he was out in space. And so, long story short, the report goes to Edgar Mitchell and it goes into his safe. And then, unfortunately, Edgar Mitchell passes away. And from that point, the memo gets out in the wild, basically gets leaked. And then the whole world realizes the reality about this conversation that allegedly took place. And by the way, that was entered into the record during some recent testimony under oath at the U.S. Congress. So there's some validity. Now, the question is, why would someone want to deny that? Because, look, if I'm having the backseat of a car and I'm having a top secret conversation or a conversation about a SAP or a conversation about an unacknowledged waved SAP, and I'm not in a skiff, that's illegal, right? That's a huge security violation. And if I'm talking to somebody who's not cleared to have that conversation, that's borderline like espionage. You're getting really close to some very serious criminal actions that, by the way, would absolutely necessitate the launching of an FBI full field counterintelligence investigation, right? Nobody wants to have that happen. Nobody wants to be part of that. In fact, one of the reasons why I submitted my book to the Pentagon for review, because I didn't want that happening to me. So it's understandable why somebody may want to say, I wasn't part of that, because the repercussions could be very, very severe. And I think this is why, not to kind of shift tracks here, but this is why we've been proposing and pushing this whistleblower protection legislation, because we want to afford protections to people to come forward and tell the truth about the reality of this program. I would if I could. I'm not allowed to, right? So if we can create this umbrella of protection for other individuals who've been part of other government UAP efforts, then we might be able to get more conversation going, allow our elected leaders in Congress to be informed, and more importantly and ultimately, the American people, which is ultimately, I think, where this conversation belongs.
To say that you were sitting on humanity's biggest secret, and the results of the conversation about this legacy program, right, which was that there were retrievals of things found at Roswell, New Mexico that people could not explain. The American taxpayer is footing the bill for these retrievals and the subsequent analysis and reverse engineering efforts, but with no proper congressional oversight. And this was this to me is the statement that explains everything that's going on. Humanity acts as if no one else is watching us, like we are alone. But here it comes. A more advanced life is likely observing us. Humanity needs to become more aware of our place in the universe and the political consequences of our actions. I believe the public has a right to know. That was your statement. I want you to be really specific. And I want you to talk about, some of my favorite parts of the book, I'm sure you're not surprised. I'm a scientist by training. The biological impacts of these encounters and the physics. That was like my favorite part. The charts, I'm into all of it. So the things that we know are true, I'm just going to give a little bit of a list here, okay? The things that we know are true. These orb sightings are accompanied by people being burned by lasers in ways that we cannot explain with our technology. People are reporting being abducted, being left catatonic. They're describing two types of aliens. One is kind of like a tall, sort of ghoulish Nordic. The other is a shorter, what many of us think of as sort of the classic alien, which we call the Greys. And things like vaporization of people and animals that can only be caused by things like lasers or radioactive weapons. There is biological material that has been obtained that we do not understand. And there's information about things that have been implanted in people, just like the stories that people tell, that seem to have a technology that does not allow us to analyze them in ways that we can understand. There are puncture wounds. There are things in people's noses. The FDA, the Department of Agriculture, all these animals that have been found with wounds that we cannot explain have been sent out to different departments, but nobody was allowed to communicate about it. So these are things that you're not making up. And even if you were, we wouldn't be at this place. This is stuff that you simply blew the whistle on by saying, this isn't about making it up. This is about the government knows and has been investigating it. Am I roughly correct here?
Yeah, let's take it a step further. It's not just me. It was our team, the entire AATIP team, and they haven't all come out yet. But when they come out of the shadows, there's going to be a lot more people who are going to learn about this. But look, there are people right now. It's documented. It's in writing. People that have come, government people, intelligence officers, military personnel that have come up close and personal to a UAP and are now on 100% medical disability by the U.S. government in writing because of their involvement in a UAP encounter, particularly one at Bentwaters in the early 1980s in England. It's called the Rendlesham incident. You can look it up. Two of the military police officers, in this case, Air Force Special Police officers, who went into the woods to actually locate the craft and wound up apparently getting injured by it. It took literally the late Senator John McCain himself to get those files declassified so these servicemen could receive the medical treatment that they deserve. That is fact. That's not Lou Elizondo. That is in government documentation, right? There are countless numbers of individuals who are under care right now by the U.S. government because of an alleged UAP encounter where they have sustained, you're right, some cases superficial burns. What some may look at and say, oh, that looks like a sunburn. In reality, it's probably a result of ultraviolet radiation. Then as you get closer, there's some individuals that actually have experienced internal organ damage. In some cases, severe organ damage. It's serious, consistent with what one would say. You say lasers, but really probably more like some sort of directed energy source. And when you look at this, I want to make sure I'm very clear here. This may not be deliberate, right? There's certainly lots of conventional technology now that if you wind up getting too close to, I often tell people, look, go to the airport, and if you go on the runway and put your head behind an engine of a 737, yeah, chances are you're going to lose your hearing and you're probably going to get burned. It's a consequence of the technology. It's not trying to hurt you, but if something is using a lot of energy and potentially just dissipating a lot of energy, if you're close to it, you're probably going to get injured. Right? So it's not really that big of a stretch to say, well, people have been hurt. We're not sure it's really deliberate. Now, there are some cases in South America and even here in the U.S. where people have actually said, no, it's deliberate. Like they've actually been, in some cases, I hate to use the vernacular, zapped, but have sustained direct energy damage that seemed to potentially be intentional. One of those incidents was in Brazil called Colares. Colares is an area of Brazil where the general, four-star general Uchoa conducted an investigation with his men and had photographs and video, and some of his personnel were injured by a craft, by a UAP.
I want to just pause here for a second because we skimmed over, and some people may not be following along entirely. We just claimed as fact that aircraft or spacecraft has been found, and that there have been encounters with other forms of life that have included laser-like zapping and impact.
Well, we have to be careful. You say spacecraft.
I don't like that he said spacecraft, Lou, because I'm on your team. Let's use the right nomenclature. Go ahead, Lou.
Yeah, we don't really know yet the true origin and source of some of these things. And so we have to, I've always told people we've got to keep all options on the table until they're no longer on the table. I know it's really easy to be tempted to say, oh, they're aliens from, out there, the Pleiades. But the reality is there's a whole lot of other options that it could be.
So can we start with the crafts, what has been found and what makes us concerned or curious? Like, for example, I know that there was, YouTube footage going around a couple months ago where that couldn't be explained. And it was this flying through the sky at a speed that no one could understand. And there's been a handful of these. And some people are like, oh, these are AI fakes. And are they real? But they're coming from military sources. So can we start with just some of the craft? Because I've heard in other interviews of whistleblowers that, every government has collected some form of these crashed artifacts or crafts, and that they're trying to reverse engineer. But like, if someone is a skeptic, how do you start to introduce the fact that, wait a second, there are ships or crafts or some form of traveling device that has the relics have been found?
So, first of all, I think healthy skepticism is important. Being a skeptic, probably not, because they're just as guilty as the true believers. They accept or deny information at face value without really challenging themselves and collecting data. So, but I do think healthy skepticism is very important. Let's start with an analogy. Maybe it can help, because first, in order to really, I think, talk about this paradigm in a new paradigm in a constructive way, we first have to challenge our own preconceived notions. So I started this conversation by explaining I am a disciple of the scientific principles and scientific methodology, always have been. I believe in mathematics. I believe in physics. It is the language of the universe. But I also know there are some fundamental things we as human beings often get wrong. The anthropologists now believe that modern humans, Homo sapiens sapien, has been roughly around between 100 to 200,000 years in its modern form. So if you take a 24-hour clock and you look at the 24 hours and say these 24 hours represents 200,000 years of human existence, it was the Greeks 2,000 years ago, right? Probably about 15 minutes ago on the clock, that said, okay, guess what? There's actually two types of life forms on this planet. And you are either A, a plant, or B, you are an animal. And human beings kind of follow animal. And it wasn't until on the clock about 5 minutes ago, during the Renaissance, roughly 300 years ago, during the Age of Enlightenment, we recognized and discovered an entirely new life form that's been coexisting on this planet all along. That is neither plant nor animal. Now, if that wasn't revelatory enough, it wasn't until 120 years ago, think about it, out of 200,000 years ago, right? The last 3 seconds maybe of our existence, maybe 5, that we actually discovered the true dominant life form, alpha, on this planet. And in fact, if you take all the biomass of every plant and the biomass of every animal and the biomass of every fungus and add it all up together, it still does not add up to the biomass of this hidden yet dominant life form on this planet. And it wasn't until we could curve glass and look through a little metal tube and famously shout, little beasties, did we discover the world of microorganisms that live inside every single one of us, that actually compose us. They live on the skin of the ISS space station, that live miles beneath the Arctic ice under the crushing depths, right? So that is the true dominant life form on this planet. And we just discovered it. We just got the technology to discover it.
Take home message, because I have an 18-year-old who literally is going to die by his skepticism and he's only 18. The take home message for people like my kid who doesn't listen to this because he hears enough of me talking at home. The take home message is we thought we knew everything at every phase of human development. We thought with absolute certainty that we knew everything about every category of our existence. And I studied the brain and nervous system, which we're still like, what? Right? The nervous system can have cells that regenerate. We thought that we should just shoot you in the face if you hurt your back, right? So what you're trying to point out is every time, and this is actually Talmudic, every time you think you know something, you don't know it. Every time you have certainty, right, you're likely wrong. Keep your mind open. Let's see what happens next. Like funguses and microbiome, yes.
100%. There was a time where we thought that there was no celestial objects in the sky other than Earth that was, terra firma, and you could also never break the sound barrier. And yet we saw all the time asteroids coming in, rocks falling in from space that were clearly not from Earth, and they were breaking the sound barrier all the time, right? So the one thing that humans usually get right is that we're usually wrong at first. And you're 100% correct. And this is no different, this topic, because the government has placed so much stigma and taboo, by the way, purposely, this topic, that it has squelched the conversation to the point where now that it has become an actual national security issue, the government is struggling trying to figure out, okay, well, gosh, we spent the last 70 years pretending like it wasn't really serious and it wasn't real. How do we treat this topic now? Right. So we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner. And you're absolutely right. I'll give you another perfect example. We as human beings, so this goes to the other question. People say, well, these spaceships from outer space. Look, I've always said they can be from outer space, inner space, or the space in between. And what do I mean by that? We, as human beings, have 5 fundamental senses that we judge our environment. And if you can't touch it, taste it, hear it, smell it, etc., we can't interact with it. And yet, if I had the ability to look through cell phone vision and look in G5 and LTE and GPS and Wi-Fi, I would see entirely different reality around me. In fact, where I live in Wyoming, I'm not there today, but where I live, we have these beautiful unoccluded skies. And yet, if you look at that same portion of the sky through a radio telescope, you see a completely different reality. You see nebula, you see in ultraviolet and infrared and X-rays. So you see a different reality. And so by that definition, most of reality lies beyond the visual spectrum of the electro-optical spectrum, which is super, super, super narrow compared to what's out there. And then you have a scale issue, right? As a scientist, I'm sure you'll appreciate this. The human being, when you look at the universal horizon in any direction, is about 13.9 billion light years. So what does that mean? It means light, which can travel at 186,000 miles per second, roughly 7.5 times around the Earth in 1 second. Imagine how far it can go in a year. And now multiply that by 13.9 billion, right? In any direction. So that's roughly 27 billion light years across, and we're in the middle. And that's the observable universe. Most scientists now believe that's actually only 10% of the actual size of the universe. So now we're bigger than 100 billion light years, right? And we're this tiny little speck in the middle. And yet, if you compare a single atom, a hydrogen atom, Avogadro's number, 1 times 10 to the negative, go all the way down, right? That's roughly the same scale. That atom, we are the size of the universe to that atom as we are the atom to the rest of the universe. And we as humans can only interact with plus or minus 1 or 2 orders of magnitude up or down. At that point, the universe either becomes simply too big or too small, and we will never be able to interact with it. And so, that's where most of the universe, the reality of the universe, actually lies. So the potential for us, and we always assume or presume we know everything, but Mylon, you're absolutely 100% right. We don't. We only perceive and can only really comprehend a very, very, very small sliver of what reality is about. You remember then as a scientist, right? We all grew up in Newtonian physics. What a great, invention that was, or discovery. And then you have Einstein's relativity, and wow, space and time is actually connected and stretchable and compressible. And then all of a sudden you have quantum mechanics, spooky action at a distance, where things can happen at the same time in different places when it shouldn't be possible. And yet that looks like that's really how the universe kind of works at the nano level. So we've got a long way to go, and I think it's very dangerous for us to just simply presume that, oh, this is impossible, because most of the time it's not only possible, it's likely.
Jonathan was asking specifically about the Interloper project. It's kind of the thing that is most in our recent memory as a 21st century society. What I learned from your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that from all of this kind of collected research and knowledge, it seems that UAP are in some way targeting or honing in on nuclear capability technology. That's just a thing. I'm not making it up. I'm not trying to be paranoid. Like, that seems to be what is happening. And it explains a lot of the time frame, right? Like post-World War II, and the location of these sightings. Interloper was a plan to use, this is like my favorite part of your book. I mean, I have many favorite parts, but this is a big one. Interloper was a plan to use one of our nuclear-powered carriers as bait. And what happened was we set up something to try and lure this kind of activity, again, we don't know what it is. It worked. This is the basis of these videos that were similar in some ways to the 2004, you call them the Tic Tac videos, which showed a kind of Tic Tac shaped craft. This time the craft was smaller, but this is what most people have heard about recently. This was kind of the first that many of us got to hear about it in the mainstream media. Tell us what these pilots were reporting. And we have the audio, we have video. What were they describing?
Sure. So let me see if I can. There's some conflation there. Let me see if I can, for your audience, kind of. No. It's probably my fault. I maybe not have been clear. So three things. One is our nuclear technology, and when I say technology, I mean propulsion, nuclear weapons, and other nuclear capabilities that we have. We've seen them over our sensitive military installations and over our national laboratory, like Oak Ridge and Savannah River facility. By the way, these are documents that have been published by the government. So this is not speculation. This is hard data from the government that's been released by the government. Right? Anybody can, if you know where to look, you can find it. So there is also some information we have where several of our ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, part of our nuclear triad, right? Our ability to respond to a nuclear strike, have been disabled by a UFO, by a UAP. In fact, an entire flight, if you think of a string of Christmas lights, how these missiles are kind of daisy-chained, the entire flight was taken offline and was witnessed by many, many Air Force personnel as these UFOs disabled our ICBMs. Because you have a nuclear-powered submarine, other nuclear-powered vessels, potentially aircraft that are potentially able to carry nuclear type.
Hold on 1 second. I just lost your audio.
Yeah, same. I think we're being attacked.
I love it. The aliens are here, Lou. They're here. Did that happen when you spoke to Joe Rogan? No, it didn't.
Did I speak to Joe Rogan? I don't remember.
The government does not operate like academia does in terms of how information is exchanged, shared, and communicated. So the notion that in an academic environment, there's an exchange of ideas, a sharing among disciplines, an openness, even to ideas that you may not agree with, a validation of concepts and of thought and belief systems. The government is not really designed for that. And I think that's sort of an important, it's an important framework for us to look at. What if this is technology that we are developing that the government just doesn't want us to know about? Is that possible?
Sure, but let's look at it from a temporal aspect. I think it's very. I can't tell you how many times a general has asked me that same question. Is it possible it's Russian or Chinese? So let's go ahead and first briefly describe some of what we're seeing, and then explain why it's likely, it's probably not. Could be, but probably not some sort of adversarial or what we call a blue force technology, our own technology. So we're talking about an object. Let's take these glasses. There's 5 fundamental observables that make UAP, UFOs stand aside and above anything that we have. So the first is we baseline our own technologies, and what we're seeing are vehicles that are performing maneuvers called instantaneous acceleration. So as a physicist, I don't have to explain to you. It is the ability to change directions or change velocity in a way where there are inertial forces that are experienced. So we experience those forces in terms of gravity. We call 1G, 2G, the force of gravity, and you multiply that, and that is those inertial forces. So a human being can withstand biologically for a very short period, a very short duration of time, about 9 Gs on the body with a G suit before you start having medical and biological consequences, things like blackouts and redouts and ultimately death. An F-16, General Dynamics F-16, which is still one of the most highly maneuverable aircraft we have, manned aircraft. It's a little bit older, but still one of the most maneuverable. At the unclassified level, can perform Gs around 17 G forces before you start having structural and mechanical failure, meaning wings begin to snap off and the plane will start to disintegrate in midair.
Too fast, right? In layperson's terms, you're going too fast.
Yeah, you're changing direction too fast, right? Or changing your velocity too quickly. And so what we are seeing are objects that are performing 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 G-force maneuvers, well beyond the healthy limitations of anything biologically to withstand, and certainly beyond the limitations of our material science. The second observable is hypersonic velocity. Now, what is hypersonic? Well, it's faster than supersonic. Supersonic is roughly 760 some miles an hour at sea level, 5 times that speed of sound. That speed is hypersonic. Now, do we have aircraft that can travel at hypersonic speeds? We absolutely do. Case in point, the Lockheed YF-12A SR-71, aka the Blackbird. Everybody knows about the Blackbird. At the unclassified level, that can do about 3,200 miles an hour. But when it wants to take a right-hand turn, it takes roughly half of the state of Ohio to do it. We are seeing vehicles that are going 10,000, 13,000 miles an hour in low Earth atmosphere, where that friction coefficient is very high, and they're doing immediate right-angle turns, and sometimes 180. Right? Another observable, it's a bit of an oxymoron, is low observability. It's hard to see on radar. It's hard to see with the naked eye. It doesn't look like it has wings or a tail or any obvious signs of propulsion. The fourth observable is transmedium or multi-medium travel, meaning it can operate in multiple domains or environments, if you will. Now, we do have vehicles that are multi-domain, right? We have, for example, a seaplane. But a seaplane is neither a very good airplane or a very good boat because you have design compromises and performance compromises in order to operate in 2 different environments.
We have that thing in Chicago where you can be in a Jeep and then it goes in the water.
Right. And it's not a really good Jeep either, or it's a very good boat, right? Yeah, you're talking about the Duck, the World War II Ducks, the old personnel carrier, armored personnel carrier. So, in essence, there's always a compromise. And what we are seeing are objects that are operating in low Earth orbit, in our atmosphere, and even underwater, without any type of performance or design compromise, right? Something that we simply don't have. And then the last observable, it's a really bad word in science. But it's anti-gravity. Now, it's not anti-gravity in the way you think. It's simply the ability to defy the natural effects of Earth's gravitational pull without the associated technologies. So what do I mean? For example, we use wings for flight, right? The 4 fundamental forces: thrust, lift, drag, and weight. When you understand that, you can build a lifting body. Wings, you create lift and you fly, provided you have thrust. Another way is through buoyancy, or lighter than air, or helium. Think of a hot air balloon. And then the last is through shear ballistics. Force equals mass times acceleration. I put enough energy behind something, Newton's law, equal and opposite reaction. And so think of an ICBM, or even throwing a baseball in the air, right? What we are seeing are objects that don't have any associated technologies that we're used to seeing, right? No wings, no ailerons, no control surfaces, no obvious signs of propulsion. And yet still they have the ability to defy Earth's gravitational pull. So when you see these vehicles doing that, one has to say, okay, this is something that we don't have. Now, back to your question, is it possible these things, some other nation has been able to do it? Well, we've been tracking these things doing this since the 1950s, early 1950s and late 1940s. So where was the United States? Well, we had just broken the sound barrier. We had just entered the atomic age, and we hadn't made it into space yet. Where was Russia? Not as far as we were. Where was China? They're in the middle of a famine. So the likelihood of that I often use a comparison. That would be like going into King Tut's tomb for the very first time in the 1920s, looking inside and all of a sudden discovering a fully assembled 747 jet sitting in the tomb, right? Temporally speaking, it doesn't make sense. They did not have the technology to do that back then. And the same holds true with us, with that argument.
It's a little bit like, tell me that UAPs exist without telling me UAPs exist. We know that there are craft that are behaving in a way that, based on our understanding of even quantum mechanics, that we cannot explain with the science and the brains that we have. We cannot explain why they behave the way they behave, why they move the way they move, or how they move the way they move.
We can't replicate it. We think we can finally explain it. We think that there's some scientific models that have, in 2015, there was this proverbial aha moment that the scientists had in the government that said, look, if you can do this, all these other things are possible.
Is that the bubble?
That's the bubble. Yeah, correct.
When we say we're observing, is it firsthand observation? Is it on camera observation? And are there pieces of these that have been collected?
Yes, yes, and yes.
And the pieces that have been collected, they've just been found discarded. Like, are you able to say more?
No, what I can say is what's in the book. I can't go beyond that. I can find myself in a lot of trouble, but the book has been approved through the Pentagon security process. So what I can say is that the U.S. government is in possession of recovered pieces of recovered vehicle and biological samples, and those materials are very, very interesting. When you understand how to do technical analysis, let's take this for example, this little battery pack for a cell phone. If I were to walk in the middle of the desert and I found this, right, I would first look at its physical properties. I would weigh it and I would say, okay, it's metallic and it weighs X amount and it's colored white. It's got white paint. It's reflective, kind of, also kind of dull. And then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to go deeper. I want to do a molecular or chemical analysis, meaning I want to look at the way fundamentally the molecules are arranged and their relationship with other molecules. So I'm going to look at its ability to conduct electricity, and I'm going to look at all sorts of things. And it turns out there's some lithium in here, so probably has the ability to store energy or power of some sort. It also is made up of aluminum, so it's a metal, roughly this type of grade. And then you go further and you just start doing the atomic or the nano level analysis, where you are starting to look now at the isotopic ratios and the actual way the atoms are arranged with one another.
That's the matrix that they create based on their atomic structure.
100%. And that is harder. You need a lot of technology and a lot of money to have that type of accuracy. And by the way, found on this planet, there's only a certain range of deviation of isotopes that are found. When you find an isotope that's beyond that, it's either A, been engineered, or B, came from somewhere else. Okay, and that's how we know, for example, speaking of King Tut's tomb, how we knew that the dagger was actually made from an asteroid, because the nickel content was not found naturally on this planet. We did the analysis, not we, the archaeologists. So it's very simple to tell if something was made here or not. And then if you say, okay, well, let's engineer it ourselves, you have to say, okay, it's going to cost us X amount of dollars to do X, Y, and Z, billions and billions and billions of dollars. And do we have the technology to do this at a manufacturing level that is sufficient? Meaning, can we mass produce it? And the answer was no. We had actually some of the greatest minds in the greatest aerospace companies. We said, this is what we need you to replicate. And they said, it can't be done. We said, no, we think it can be. And so after a cost of $1 million, I can't say which company, but at the cost of $1 million, a very reputable government aerospace company, cost $1 million, and it wound up breaking the machine. And they created what looked like a little brick of this material combined together. Well, what the government has in its possession is far more intricate than that, multi layers. And when we asked the aerospace company, can you go ahead and replicate it? They said no. And when you actually had to show them for them to go, oh my, wow, okay, someone has been able to do that. And when you ask them how much it would cost to do that, they said, well, first of all, we don't have the technology now. Well, actually, we might now. This is 3 years ago. We didn't have the technology then, and the cost would have been exorbitant. When you say that material, when you find where that material was found and when it was found, decades earlier, no one on the planet had that ability. In fact, arguably, still people don't have that ability. There's still countries we still can't do it. So, again, this is that temporal aspect that you're forced to reconcile. Okay, well, the material's real. It's here. We know it's real. We can touch it. We can test it, but we still can't make it. Right. And so that is very compelling evidence. And by the way, other countries, back to your point, other countries have material as well. I personally put my hands on alleged material that was recovered from up there, metallic material. And, could it be from an old Russian satellite? Sure, I guess it could. But the analysis that's coming back and that's being done by some very reputable scientists is coming back very interesting. And by the way, to the point where even the U.S. government had something called a CRADA agreement, which was a research agreement with an old organization I used to be affiliated with to study allegedly recovered UFO material. That's in the open press. Anybody can look at it. It says this is what we want. We want to analyze it. So there's a lot of interest there, right? From a material science perspective, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where really things start to get interesting.
You use a beautiful example, which makes me feel very emotional, especially because your mother was part Cherokee and you have Cherokee heritage. And there's this example that you give that, and this, sorry, just emotional. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, we all know what happened. There was a devastation of a culture and a complete, breakdown of, I think, humanity in terms of what happened when the Spanish arrived. But one of the components you talk about is that the indigenous people had never seen technology like they were seeing. Meaning, imagine if you've never seen a gun, you've never seen a boat, you've never seen machinery, you've never seen armor of this variety. You don't know how to process. Like, the human brain does not know how to process things that are outside of our realm of what we've experienced, which is why babies don't know what the heck is happening for like the first 3 months. They're like, what? I'm part of my mother. And if you've ever seen you ever seen that kind of analysis of what happens when something is introduced that you have no frame of reference for, it looks a lot like what you're describing. And what the analogy was is the Inca had no frame of reference to understand what was happening and may have perceived that this is something alien.
Yeah, they actually did. When the conquistadors first came over on their ships, they had never seen a ship, and they had never seen armor, and they had never seen a horse. And so when the conquistadors came from Spain during the La Reconquista, the reconquering, when they landed on the shores of the beach, you're absolutely right. The Inca actually thought it was a single monster. They did not understand it was a human in armor riding on a horse because they had no frame of reference. And that is exactly what we see today. I tell people all the time, look, imagine 300 years ago walking in the desert and finding Da Vinci or Michelangelo, finding a garage door opener, right? What in the hell would that be used for? First of all, it's made of plastic. They've never seen plastic. Second of all, it has batteries. Thirdly, the electromagnetic spectrum hasn't even been discovered yet, right? So what is this magical thing? What is it used for?
And it's not about intelligence. This is not a story about
Correct.
that the Inca couldn't understand because their brains didn't have the capacity. The Incas did incredibly beautiful, sophisticated, cultural, monumental things, as did all of the indigenous tribes. It is that even the most intelligent people, the most learned, the most sophisticated, we've built governments, we've gone to the moon, we've done all these things. If there is something that is outside of what we can understand, we will hide it. We will come up with legislation to prevent people from talking about it. We will convince everyone that they are crazy if they think about it. And we will introduce an entire level of conversation where the only indefensible thing is you're crazy, right? What is it like to be told that you're crazy?
Well, I've been married 30 years, so I'm told I'm crazy all the time, but for different reasons. Not because of this topic. The reality is it's an unnecessary label that is used when we don't understand something. Look, you can call people crazy all you want, but Einstein was called crazy, right? There were a lot of people in history that were called crazy. Galileo, when he first proposed that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, they almost burned him for it, right? Heretical. Turned out he wasn't crazy, right? They even refused to look through the very telescope to confirm his observations. So I think it's when you're labeled crazy, I do think there's a fine line between genius and crazy. I think crazy is a label that society gives when you don't really fit in, maybe to the normal, stream, if you will, of consciousness. I think it's a cop out. We've had a lot of our pilots that were labeled crazy. They were taken off flight status. They were had psychological evaluations in the military, especially if you reported a UFO. It's funny because if you go right now to any airport or train station, you always hear the announcements, the DHS announcements. If you see something suspicious, report it. Well, this wasn't happening in the intelligence community or the Department of Defense. In fact, it was the opposite. If you see something, don't report it. And in fact, every time now, you can look at it in modern terms, every time a Russian surveillance aircraft comes near Alaska or California, what's the first thing we do? Well, we launch 2 F-22s and we escort it out of our airspace, and it's all over the news, all over headline news. Well, these things don't have that response. In fact, it's crickets. And it's because, if they had a Russian star on its tail or a North Korean tail number, it'd be a different story. But because these things don't even have a tail or a wing, nobody wants to have the conversation. And to the point where we've had almost mid-air collisions. We have flight safety reports, almost mid-air collisions, where these UAP have literally split a combat formation right down the middle. That's how close they have come to our aircraft. Let me put this in another context real quick. Let's remind the audience here. It wasn't until the last year or two that we started recalibrating our radars to start looking for UAP. Guess what we started seeing? This is after we told everybody, oh, we know everything in our skies. We started seeing Chinese spy balloons just wafting over our country, collecting intelligence, right? And here we are telling the American people, oh, we know everything in our sky. You couldn't even track a balloon. So, yeah. I mean, you're right. I'm going to get in trouble for saying that, I'm sure. But
No.
anyways.
Please. Okay. I love when you get in trouble because it made an amazing book. I want to talk a little bit more about the cover-up because Jonathan and I talk about this in realms of nutrition. We talk about it in realms of pesticide use. We talk about it in realms of ultra-processed food, which the mainstream media keeps trying to convince me is good for me when I know that it's not, right? Like it's like that stuff kind of, bends the mind. One of the sort of like meta complexities of your decision to resign so that you could alert the American public and the global public to what is going on. The meta complexity is that it's not just that you chose to reveal information that has been hidden. You chose to reveal that the government had been giving instructions of how to cover this up, how to lie, how to hide evidence. And to me, that you blew the whistle on two things. You blew the whistle on UAPs exist and the government knew, and the government was actively trying to encourage people to cover it up, teach people how to lie, and create, I think, potentially more hysteria around this. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the government was afraid of with this information?
Sure. Well, let's start with the basic question: why do governments lie? There are legal reasons. For example, if you look at the definition of covert action, that is what they call in our community an honest lie. You're lying about an operation in order to save American lives, right? No, we're not sending in an alpha team to go in and save hostages until after we save them. And then we said, oh, yeah, we kind of did that, right? I'm not worried about those kind of lies because they're designed to help and protect the American people. What I don't like are lies to cover and obfuscate truth or embarrassment or malfeasance, right? So there are reasons to have something secret. And I'm the first one, if you ever ask me to choose national security over disclosure, I will absolutely always choose national security because I'm a patriot. I love my country. I love my fellow citizens and I love my government. What I don't like is when people abuse the bureaucracy and make the unilateral decision upon themselves to do something on behalf of everybody else when they don't have that authority. So what do I mean? We can only classify information in this country for the most part to protect two things: sources and methods. It is illegal to classify information simply because it's inconvenient to have the conversation or it's embarrassing or anything like that, or to cover up criminal action. It's actually legal. There are requirements to inform Congress from a budgetary perspective and an oversight perspective through certain committees, all intelligence and military operations. When someone in the government makes a decision on behalf of everybody else that they're not going to inform Congress, they're not going to inform the president, they're not going to do the things because they think they know better, that's the problem I have. No one has that authority. No one is above our Constitution or our law. Either our Constitution means something or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you better let the American people know because they know how to take care of business if they have to. So it's a very dangerous, slippery slope when someone begins to do that. I'll share with you a story when my father passed away last Father's Day, not this one, but the one before. And I got very close to my father towards the end, and he had cancer. He didn't tell me he had cancer, but I could tell towards the end he was dying. And so a month before he died, we had a chance to do a road trip. And so we drove from my home in Wyoming down to South Florida, down to Miami, where, the rest of us Cubans live. And we went down there. And I asked my father about halfway through the trip, almost flippantly, I actually feel pretty embarrassed about it now looking back. I said, Dad, what do you think is the greatest threat to humanity? Now I'm thinking to myself, it's a pandemic, a disease, maybe terrorism.
Bad Cuban food.
He said, "Yeah, right. Bad black beans and rice." He said, "Son, it's corruption." I thought for a second. I said, "Corruption, like financial corruption?" He said, "No, corruption. Corruption is the act of sacrificing or giving up your own values in exchange for something, whether it's religious corruption, governmental corruption, financial corruption, moral corruption. Corruption is corruption. And when you do that, my father was a revolutionary. He was in the Bay of Pigs. He knows what tyranny is. He said, if you're in the government and you are corrupt, you start chiseling away the very foundation of what a democracy is. And once you start doing that, it's a very, very slippery slope down to tyranny. And he was right. He's absolutely right. And so this is why I think transparency and accountability is so important in our government. Also with this topic, not just with this topic, the UAP, but all topics, because ultimately that is the only reason why our government works, because we all have faith and confidence in our institutions. And if someone is circumventing that or short-circuiting that process, that is a corrupt process. And that's not good for our country. And that's really one of the reasons why I'm so steadfast on UAP disclosure.
Why do you think the government allowed you to declassify this information and allowed you to share this now?
Can I give my answer before you give yours, Lou?
Sure.
I don't know if there had been anyone like Lou Elizondo before who had been given the kind of information that he was trusted to keep and protect, but also ultimately felt compelled to answer to a higher source. I mean, that's my answer for you, but I don't know what yours is.
Maybe along those lines. I can't answer on behalf of the U.S. government. What I can tell you is that when I first came out, there were a lot of people really upset with me. A lot in the government. They're like, "Hey, man, don't come back here no more. This is you're not welcome back." But privately, people would reach out and said, "Hey, man, look, we're really proud you did what you did. The time has come for this conversation to occur. This is the worst kept secret at this point. We've got people that are almost colliding into these things with our aircraft. Someone needs to do something." As the conversation became more acceptable, you went from having whispers about UFOs in the back end of a skiff in the Pentagon to now people in the lunchroom openly talking about UFOs, right? So that stigma and that taboo is now being dissipated, and there's a faction within the U.S. government that I believe, because I've spoken to them, that want the truth to come out. That this is not a conversation, like I said before, like it's like fine wine where you keep a cork on it. We're well beyond the expiration of this topic, and now we need to have this conversation with the American people, because I submit to you, there are pieces of this conversation that I don't want my government telling me what to think about it, right? From a national security perspective, hey, that's cool. I'm okay with that because that's your job. But from a philosophical, psychological, sociological, theological perspective, that's no one's damn business. That's the government's not. That's not their responsibility, and I don't want their business in my business. I want the American people to decide what that means to them from their perspective.
Also, with all the footage that is surfacing more and more, it's harder and harder to really deny. And so we're creating a chasm between the footage that is available, people talking about it, podcasts that are talking about it, and a government who's like, they're losing credibility in the space if they're not willing to acknowledge some element of it. So we're at a collision point.
We are 100%. Look, I've got members of Congress privately telling me, "Look, I saw a UFO with my son while fishing, come right out of the lake." I mean, this is no longer a secret. When lawmakers are telling you, "Look, I've personally witnessed this thing," right? You have people in the executive branch. You have the former director of national intelligence, Ratcliffe, the former director of the CIA, Brennan. You have a former president of the United States coming on saying, "Yeah, there's something to it. This is real. We need to look at it." I mean, that's not me telling you. That's your government telling you.
What do you think this intelligent life form wants with humanity. You know, you describe in your book that you have had experiences yourself that your home was invaded by orbs over the course of 7 years. It was witnessed by your wife, your 2 daughters. You've had firsthand accounts. Like, is there a personal relationship that, like, hey, they know that you know stuff, so they're trying to interact with you? What do you, both personally and at a collective level, what do you think they want with humanity?
So I don't know. And let me also preface, I don't like to give my opinion because the one thing we know, you can be, one thing I've learned in intelligence, you can be absolutely sure of something and still be absolutely wrong. So my opinion really doesn't matter. What I can tell you is what the data suggests. And then you can infer what you want from it.
Also, use the gorilla example. I want you to explain the gorilla example in this answer.
Okay, sure. You got it. Gorilla as well. My family and I, when I was part of the AATIP program, we were exposed to some very interesting things. These luminous balls, green balls of light, very diffuse, that would go in and out of the house. The neighbors have also seen it. And by the way, it wasn't just my family. Other individuals, other members who were part of AATIP also experienced these type of activities around their house. Now, are they related to UFOs? I don't know. Could it be ball lightning? Could it be St. Elmo's fire? Could it be a plasma discharge because I had faulty wiring in my house?
It could be government surveillance also. It could be government surveillance.
What it could be, who knows? It could be a natural, aberration of the atmosphere. Who knows? But what I do know is that it was witnessed by many people, not just me. It was also being encountered by other colleagues of mine at their houses at the same time as well, during the time we were working AATIP. So I found that very interesting. And I wanted to put it in the book because maybe there's a connection. Maybe there's not. Maybe there is. Now, back to the gorilla analogy. This is an analogy that was used to try to explain why someone may be interested in human development, right? So you go from, and let me see how I can caveat this, because this was some of the theories that were proposed by some of the scientists and the academics in our program.
Yeah, and it comes directly from the conversation of the way you said it was a threat is a threat is a threat. And once you classify something as potentially threatening, it is your responsibility, meaning you felt in the position you were in, it is your responsibility to act on what could potentially be a threat. Meaning, if something is benign, you don't have to create a threat. If something is totally like fine and interesting or even spooky and weird, you don't have to create a threat. But there is enough evidence, and it's hard to not go into the physics, but like there's enough evidence about what happens with hydrogen atoms. There's enough evidence about what happens over water. There's enough evidence about what happens when light refracts that we know that there's a specificity to this that indicates that it could be a threat, which we need to then take as a threat. And gorilla analogy.
Yeah, so let's start with a threat, and I'll kind of weave that into the gorilla analogy. Let me ask you a question real quick. I'm sure you live in a lovely neighborhood, as many people in your audience do. Let me ask you: do you lock the front door before you go to bed at night?
Yes.
Okay, I do too. And by the way, I think most people would agree, even though you don't expect anything bad to happen, it's just kind of a good idea. But long story short, some people may even go the extra step and make sure that the windows are locked, and they might even turn their alarm system before they go to bed. Let's say one Sunday morning you wake up to have a nice hot cup of tea or coffee, and as you walk downstairs, you notice size 12 muddy boot prints on your living room carpet. Now, no one's been hurt, nothing's been taken, but despite the front door being locked and your windows being locked and your alarm being on, there are now muddy boot prints on your carpet floor that were not there the night before. So my question to you is that a threat? Well, my response is it could be if it wanted to be, so we should probably figure out how they're getting into the house and what they want. And this is the same analogy with the government, right? These things are coming over controlled U.S. airspace over sensitive military installations completely unimpeded. There's not a damn thing we can do about it. We probably should figure out what's going on. Now, to the gorilla analogy, we've noticed a steady increase in UAP activity and interest in our nuclear capabilities. There's a theory behind that, and it has to do with energy, deriving energy. So let's go back to our Homo sapiens sapien 200,000 years ago. All of a sudden, about 2,000 years ago, we realized that if you heat water and it expands roughly 1,700 times its volume, that can be turned into energy and used And in fact, it's what led to the Industrial Revolution and the steam engine, right? Then someone got smart and realized that if you now don't just separate the molecules from each other, but you actually break apart the molecules in an exothermic reaction, you go a little deeper into the material, you get a what, right? So this is a 1 times 10 to the third release of energy. If I convert an exothermic reaction roughly in a chemical process, it's roughly 1 times 10 to the fourth yield exothermic reaction. If I then go even smaller than that and I break apart the atom, right, in a nuclear fission process, that's a 1 times 10 to the fifth yield, what is referred to as kiloton yield. And if I go all the way down, nuclear process, 1 times 10 to the sixth, that's a, yes, ma'am, you got it. That's it.
Page
That is
166.
megaton yield. And it turns out there's two fundamental ways to warp space-time. And that is with a lot of mass, and we know it all the time. Earth warps space-time. It's actually an expression of gravity. The sun does, a black hole does in an extreme form. But you can also warp space-time with a heck of a lot of energy. What I try to explain people is consider mass and energy as coefficients of each other. Think of mass as ice. Think of energy as steam. They're fundamentally the same thing, but in two different states. When you take matter and you annihilate it, you get pure energy, etc. So the more energy you have the ability to warp space-time. It just turns out you need a whole heck of a lot of it. How much? Well, if you talk to the people at the CERN and the Large Hadron Collider, they believe that they're now approaching those levels where they can start creating micro black holes in the laboratory. Meaning they can now start creating small pockets where you can literally warp space-time through energy to the point where you can create a small black hole, very, very, very at the nano level. So there's no danger there. The point being is that mass and energy can warp space-time, and it turns out that if these technologies are warping space-time, it's possible that any species that gets to a certain point in development, meaning they understand how the atom works. And once you understand the atom, you understand the nucleus. Once you understand nucleus, you understand quarks. Once you understand quarks, it's a very quick process. It may be a matter of fait accompli. If you don't destroy yourself in the process within 600, 200, 500 years of discovering the secrets of the atom, you may now be able to replicate that technology. You may be able to warp space-time in a way that allows you to do the things that we are seeing these UAP doing. And if that's the case, is it possible that our friends from out of town are monitoring us? Are they watching us? Are they looking at us and saying, okay, the little monkeys here that are look cute in the exhibit there, chewing on the banana, they're nice because they're over there and they're stuck in their cage. But what happens when that little gorilla figures out the zookeeper dropped the key to the cage, to the enclosure, and now day by day, he's getting closer and closer to turning the key and the relationship that key has to the cage. Well, it turns out that once that little gorilla figures out how to get out of that enclosure, you've got an entirely different situation on your hands. You've got a 600, 800-pound silverback gorilla. You got Harambe now on the loose. So better hold on to little Johnny, because now you've got this monkey that's loose in the zoo. And who knows what he's going to do. Let's face it, we are not necessarily a very peaceful species, right? Pretty much every invention we have, we figure out a clever way to use it against each other. So maybe one of the theories is that they're just monitoring our development. Are we really ready to have that kind of technology available to us? If you look at some of these countries out there, maybe even our own, some would argue, no, we're not. You mentioned some of these things that we do to each other, whether it's through food and anything else. We do a lot of nasty things for profit. We have done a lot of nasty things in all in the vein of science and humanity and evolving as a species, but they haven't all been very nice, have they? And so we have to ask ourselves, are we really ready for this technology? If that is a real concern, what does that mean for us? Are we really ready to go out and meet our neighbors? We haven't been really good to ourselves inside the house. We have a pretty messy home. Are we really ready to go out and shake hands with, the person next door?
I definitely do not want to release a lot of humans into the known or unknown universe. I don't think we are at all ready to be stewards.
Spoken like a true Canadian.
Everyone should stay home and get better at living on Earth.
Well, I wonder, Lou, can you speak a little bit to the patriotism of this? Because, it's especially a really interesting time in our country right now to think about what does it mean to truly love this country, to truly love humanity, right? And this is not about politics, because Lord knows if I could figure it out, I wouldn't be sitting here with Jonathan. So, but we're having a lot of conversations about what does it mean to defend the Constitution? What does it mean to be a loving American? What does it mean to tell the truth about what is happening? And you could say this on either side and everywhere in the middle, right? But what's fascinating to me from what you just said is, I'm a lover of humanity, but a lot of people behave in ways that are very, very harmful. And I mean that on a personal level. I mean that on a community level and on a government level, right? And part of what you did, and part of the sort of the penance that I believe the government had to give, not just to you, but to the American people, was to say, we don't get to keep pretending that everything is okay. We don't get to keep pretending that we're the smartest government in the world and we're the most humane army in the world. No country can claim that, right? But I wonder if you can talk about where this fit into, especially as, your dad was an immigrant and you served this country. You laid your life on the line over and over and over for people you didn't know, for governments that you didn't understand, and for causes that may not have even made sense to you, right? How is revealing what you chose to reveal the way you revealed it an act of patriotism?
Sure. Well, let me pile on to your first observation. I agree with you. I often tell people I love humanity. It's humans that I don't particularly like, but I love humanity. I think to be a patriot, you have to do things sometimes that don't seem very patriotic at the time. I took an oath to defend this country from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to serve the American people. I take that oath very seriously. I have not yet ever been relieved of that oath. It is a lifelong oath that I took. And it turns out that the enemy in some cases was the bureaucracy. We have a responsibility to speak truth to power. Why is that? Because this is a government that is for the people and by the people. And if you forget that, then you shouldn't serve the public interest. You shouldn't be in government. The American people are as the American people, the government serves us. We do not serve the government. And we forget that because we rely on the government to make decisions for us. And sometimes the government may go beyond their authorities and in the interest of the public make decisions that really aren't in the interest of the public. And frankly, it's not up to them to decide. It's up to us, the people, to decide. And so, my idea of loyalty came from, look, I'm the first one to tell you, I went to war so people could be who they want to be and what they want to be. Just don't tell me what I have to be, but I'll defend your right. I don't care if I agree with it or not. I'll defend your right and your life so you can do it, and put my life on the line deliberately so you have the right to express yourself however you want to do that. What I don't agree with is when people force, and governments force their interpretation of rights on me. Right? I don't want the government to tell me that this is a certain way of expected behavior towards certain things. The government has a long history of doing good things, but it also has a long history of doing bad things. I mean, look from the medical perspective. Look at the syphilis experiments we did. We let people die when we had cures, just so we could see what would happen. Right? Human beings. We did things where we tested LSD on the public, to see what would happen.
Then we made LSD illegal when people started having transcendental experiences and wanted to be loving and kind to each other.
Right, exactly. And so, we don't always make the right decision. And at the end of the day, I tell people, look, if you're mad at your government, look in the mirror, because it's up to you to change it. If you don't like it, then do something about it. Don't sit back and just cry about it and say, oh, it's all their fault. Do something. Get up. You've got a voice. You've got fingers. You can write to your member of Congress. You can get involved. Don't be a victim. Victim is a cop out. That's a cheap way. Don't do that. If I played the victim on this, I never would have come out and just kept my high paying government job and lived on the government, dole and retired comfortably. This country means a lot more than that. People died. People always come to me and say, oh, Lee, you're this hero. No, I'm not a hero. I'm just a regular dude. I know what a hero is because I served with them, and some of them didn't make it back. So I know what a real hero is. I'm just a regular dude that is doing what I said I would do, that anybody else in my position would have done the same, maybe even better job than me. And that's my perspective. And I think we have an obligation, a moral obligation, to make sure this government works in the interests of the American people. I quit the government out of loyalty, not disloyalty. I quit to finish the very job they gave me in the first place. I don't want to destroy anything. I'm trying to fix it. And it's tough because, it's not like a car. When your car overheats, you can take it to the shop, they put it up on lifts, and, they can take the engine apart and replace the water pump. We've got to fix it while the car is doing 80 miles an hour down a highway with kids inside. That's a lot more difficult to do. And so this is kind of what motivates me to do what I'm doing. It's just have the government do what it's supposed to do. I'm not asking for a lot. Just work right. And if the government at the end of the day talks to Congress and the American people say, hey, this is great, but you know what? This is not really our priority. Cool, fine. But you know what? At least you had a chance to make that decision for yourself. It wasn't made by some bureaucrat sitting in some office that doesn't want you to know. And so that's what it means to me to be a patriot and to be loyal.
This is what I wrote down. What the actual fuck is going on if we admit that we are not alone in the universe? I wonder, is there a possibility that there will be, I don't know, like mass hysteria, or that people will freak the F out if people act? Is that why people resist this information? Like, is that why my teenagers are like,
I think, first of all, America can handle the truth. And I think America deserves the truth. And I think the world does. There was a time where the U.S. government had several studies done where they said, if you have this conversation now, you're going to create panic and mass hysteria. People are going to lose their minds. They're going to lose their faith in God. We cannot have this conversation now. That was a real study done by the U.S. government. I don't agree with that. Look, it's been the last 6-7 years now, and we've been having this conversation thanks to people like you that are willing to have this conversation, thanks to people like your audience that are interested and curious. And you know what? They're still paying their mortgages. They're still paying their cell phone bills. They're still going to the PTA meetings and with their kids at school. Society hasn't broken down, has it? What you're referring to is what is called sometimes as ontological shock, or this crisis of conscience, right? Where people say, I can't deal with this information. I just can't accept it. But look, we have been here before. Let's face it. These paradigm moments in humanity's existence occur all the time. They don't occur very often in one's lifetime, but they occur as a species all the time. And there are these moments, for example, where our universe gets suddenly a whole lot bigger. Maybe when we first come out of the cave and we gaze upon the heavens, we say, wow, the universe is really a lot bigger than the cave I live in. Maybe when we struck two rocks together and created fire, and all of a sudden now we could illuminate the darkness, and the monsters hiding behind the bushes, well, they were just bushes, right? Also, when maybe two fishermen were standing on a stony beach and one looks to the other and says, I'm going to sail over the horizon. I'm going to do that. And the other guy said, you can't do that because you're going to fall off the earth, and there's sea monsters and giant krakens and they'll destroy your ship. Now, right, we kind of laugh about that, but you know what? In reality, they were right, because it turns out that there are sea monsters, except for they're called blue whales and great white sharks and the great squid of the Pacific. And they're not really sea monsters, are they? They're just part of our nature. They're part of our natural environment. And so maybe with this topic, we're just standing on the shores of another beach about to sail over the next horizon. This is maybe our destiny. This is where we are supposed to go as a species, as humanity, to constantly explore the unknown. It is in our DNA to reach for the heavens, reach for the stars, whether it's spiritually or intellectually or physically.
Okay, this is the perfect segue into my final question. So there are those among us who walk among us who believe all this stuff, and they've believed it since before Imminent came out, right? There are people who have what they would describe as access to other sources of energy, to other awareness about our existence, about other things. There are people who seem to be more predisposed to experiencing things that we cannot explain, to understanding things that cannot be understood. We sometimes call it intuition. Perhaps historically it was called shamanism or prophecy, right? If you read, and you actually quote from this, if you read the Book of Prophets and you look at it like an intuitive, fascinating, transcendental spiritual experience, You have a completely different framework. This wasn't people walking around being like, I see gargoyles, right? This was, I have access to something that allows my brain to perceive something outside of our normal experience. But in certain cases, and this has happened, as you said, through all of human history, there have been people who believed, and they were ridiculed. They were burned at the stake. They were shunned. I see them in their little online groups, right? They have to huddle together and they can't speak too loud. Your book is kind of bridging some of this complexity. And I wonder if you can talk about, do you have any different understanding personally of people who claim to be intuitive or people who claim to believe in this stuff from long ago without the physics, without the evidence, without any of the government telling us that it's okay to believe what we want to believe? Who are those people in this context?
Well, the government has had a long-standing interest in some of this metaphysical attributes you're talking about. In fact, one of my colleagues, Dr. Hal Puthoff, was the godfather, if you will, to the CIA's psychic espionage program called Stargate, or remote viewing. Before that, it was called Operation Grill Flame and a bunch of other names before that, where we actually trained soldiers to be psychic spies. And by the way, Russia did the same thing. And there's some very compelling data to suggest that it actually worked. It was very effective. Now, with that said, um, belief is something very interesting. There's several types of truths in the world. There is a universal truth, like gravity, right? If I drop this, it's going to fall, just like you and me and everything else. But then you have something called personal truths that are just as truthful as those, but they're not accepted by everybody. So what do I mean by that? Politics, religion. People are, I am absolutely sure this is the only God in the world, right? But if you talk to somebody else, they're just as sure. And so that's a personal truth. And so we have to recognize that there is a difference. One's not more important than the other, but there's a difference between a personal truth, which is not universally accepted, and a universal truth, which is. And then we have to understand that there are aspects to the human being that is beyond the physical body and our mind. What do I mean by that? Well, if I get into a car accident, I lose a limb, I'm still Lou. In fact, if I get into an accident, I lose all my limbs. I'm still Lou. I'm still who I am. And if I get a traumatic brain injury, and now I've got cognitive issues with my intellect, the essence of Lou is still there. I'm still Lou, right? So it's not really my intellect or my body that defines who I am or who you are. There's something else. There's something that is more indelible, something more intimate that defines us. And when people say, "Well, that's nonsense," well, let me ask you a very simple question. I'll ask you: do you love your children?
Yes.
How do you know? Prove it. Right now, my point being is
I breastfed for a combined 6 years, Lou. I really, really love them.
Yeah. No, it's a trick question.
My bone marrow, they got it all.
Yeah. No, it's a trick question. My point is that we all recognize love, and yet we all will describe it a little bit differently. It's very elusive. How do you prove it? You can't. And yet it is a universally, unless you're sociopathic, perhaps, it's a universally accepted.
Just on the weekends.
Attribute that is beyond. In fact, love doesn't even make logical sense. It actually sometimes works counter to like this maternal instinct that only a mother has, right? Where you're willing to lay down on the railroad track to protect your child. From a biological perspective, that doesn't make sense because you're putting yourself in harm's way, and yet it is real. And so there are fundamental attributes of a human being that you can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't hold on to it, and yet it is the primary motivation many times for doing what we do as a human, as a species, right? I think we have to be very careful. Look, we realize, going back to the original analogy, most of reality lies beyond our five senses. Okay, that's just a fact. So we should probably embrace that understanding sooner rather than later. And if you don't believe it, use your cell phone. That's proof. I mean, that's marking off of frequencies that are beyond our comprehension. And yet they are enabling this conversation we're having now. Imagine this: electrons are flowing through a wire, then going through there's an electromagnetic pulse that is going through the sky into space, bouncing off of a satellite, hitting another satellite, coming down to a ground station, going through fiber optics, being transmitted to light, coming up to your computer, and bam, you and I are having this magical conversation, and we are separated by thousands of miles, right? Magic, or just progression? right? A lot of things that seem magical today is really just tomorrow's technology. But then there's the other part, which is the unexplainable. That part of us that's not technologically based, it's spiritually based. It's a reason why some people are gravitated towards the Torah and the Talmud, or you gravitate to the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran, because there's something there in the soul, the spirit, the id, the chi, whatever label du jour you want to give it. There's something there that is beyond the physical sense of what it means to be a human. And that's partly maybe where my patriotism comes from, why I'm doing what I'm doing, because I have this overriding belief that it is the right thing to do. I must do it. I don't have a choice.
And so to kind of close that loop, if we look at people who are intuitive, if we look at people who historically would have been shamans, right, would have been healers, it could be, and you talk about this in the book, is it the caudate putamen? Is it like, are there parts of the brain that we can hone in on and say there are people who are more either susceptible, or you might say like, oh, easily gullible, so suggestible, but maybe they're actually more open.
Sure. Look, there's a couple experiments that were done. Fascinating, by the way. If I, let me ask you another little test here real quick. And by the way, it's not a trick question. There's no right or wrong answer. But if I were to ask you in the most simplest terms that either one of you, in fact, a sentence or less, few words as possible, what would your definition of the past be?
It's the things that happened before this second that I'm speaking in right now.
Perfect. How about things that have already occurred? Mm-hmm. Right? A past. And by that same logic, what is the future? Things that haven't happened yet, right?
Only if you believe in a linear nature of time.
We're getting there. Good. So you're tracking. This is where we're going. So what is the present? Well, the present isn't really a moment in space-time. The present is a transitory process where the future becomes the past. And a way to maybe to visualize that is, think of a cigar, whereas the ashes of the cigar that have already burned is the past. And the part of the cigar that hasn't burned yet is the future. And the cherry, that moment of ignition where the future becomes the past, is the present. And in real life, it's probably expressed in Planck time. It's a super, super, super small moment of space-time. And it's always moving. There's no such thing as now, because now doesn't exist. It's always moving forward.
Now is as you're saying now, and then it's already gone.
Gone, right. And so the point being is that we live in this illusion of the now, but the now is really very fuzzy and always moving forward. And if you look at some of the quantum mechanical models of the electron cloud and whatnot, there is some information that kind of reinforces this idea. But is it possible so if you look at that cherry of the cigar and you were to focus in and kind of remove some of the glare, you would notice something very interesting happening. You would notice that the cigar burns uneven. There are elements of the tobacco that are lighting before the other, and ashes. And so therefore, when you really get down to it, time gets very fuzzy when you get to the very, very small. You start getting into this range where there's really no point in time. It's kind of this fuzzy spectrum. And is it possible that's how some of these clairvoyants or these other individuals live, whereas that some people experience the now? Imagine that cherry a little bit bigger, where more elements of the future and more elements of the past are experienced as if they're happening right now. And so therefore, it's a quantum process, and you are able to perceive things that most people think is voodoo magic, and yet is really just quantum science.
That was the best explanation of...
You say that to all your guests. Come on.
No!
That was literally the best explanation for hippie, intuitive, whatever it might be. And I use hippie very, very loosely here. There's a lot of people who maybe don't have that skill and ability or are aspiring to it. But I mean, I'm blown away.
I'm also blown away. I mean, like you said, we live in an illusion of the now. Lou, you're like a poet, and you're like not a government worker who killed people all over the world.
I'm Cuban, and I have to think in very simple terms.
You're Cuban and you're Jewish. You're a unicorn.
I'm a Cuban, right? And I am literally. I have to think in very simple terms and use analogies, because that's not how my brain works. If you start mentioning complex ideas, I get lost. So I have to color by the numbers.
Okay, one more question, and then we let you go. what are your kids like? What is your wife like? Like, your
Oh
wife
my
didn't even
gosh.
know you were studying all of this. Like, your wife didn't know what your job was. You'd come home like, just another day at the office. Like, you couldn't tell her. Your kids, like, your whole life, you had one of the most public resignations that our country has seen about one of the most sensitive things to our humanity. How did your wife and kids adjust to, like, that you're their
Wow.
dude?
Well, first of all, my kids are the greatest accomplishment and achievement I will ever have in my life. Nothing will ever come close to that. But I will tell you, and thankfully, that they love me, because the conversation I had with my wife the first time when I was about to do what I was about to do, let's just say that conversation went over like a lead balloon. My, not well.
Like a
My
spy balloon from outer space.
Yeah, my wife was like, "What are you? You're going to leave your job for what? You know, are people really worth it? Are they ready for it?" And but I have an amazing family, and I have the support, and that's the only reason why I've been able to get through it all. Even during the time when they were trying to discredit me and investigate and stuff like that, I never would have made it through had it not been for my family. And I'm very blessed, and I don't mean that lightly. I mean, there's people say, "Oh, I'm blessed." No, I really am. I mean, it's gotten me through war. It's gotten me through adversity. And I am the luckiest man alive. I could die tomorrow, and I will die with a smile on my face because of having the opportunities I have with an amazing family. I think if more people had families like that, we probably wouldn't have war.
The UAP legislation language is available online. The UAP Disclosure Act was eventually signed in 2023 by President Biden, which says that Congress has to approve taxpayer money being used for UAP research that we don't know about, and national archives have to collect government documents and unidentified anomalous phenomena, technologies of unknown origin, and non-human intelligence. Thank you, Lou Elizondo, for your service to this country. Thank you for talking to us. We are just such huge fans, not just of what you revealed, but the way that you chose to reveal it and the eloquence and intelligence with which you present this information. The book, Inside the Pentagon's Hunt for UFOs, Imminent, by Luis Elizondo, former head of the Department of Defense's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and American hero.
It has been my sincere honor and privilege. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If there's anything I can ever do for you, let me know.
We just think you're it, Lou. You are it. Thank you.
Lou was in the middle of talking about how
legit
entities were seen and targeted our military our military capability.
Nuclear ballistics technology was discovered to be disabled by UAPs, phenomenon that we do not understand and cannot understand with the current technology that we have. And this is reported by the US government.
He was also saying that these UAPs tend to congregate around military sites interested in nuclear technology. And as he's describing it, sound goes out.
Disabled.
He was disabled. He was taken from us.
Here's skeptical breakdown number one. Maybe this is technology that the US government is developing. And that's why when people find it, they're like, we don't know what this is. And scientists are like, we don't know what this material is. And what is this slimy, translucent substance that keeps showing up? And why are animals being killed in a way that we literally cannot explain by any technology we know? The answer could be the government, you don't get to know everything the government's doing. And they have technology you don't know about. And it's for your own good. Like, just sit there and look pretty, American people. And it could be that. However, the response to that is then President Biden and the nonpartisan committee that was responsible for releasing this information would have included that in the documentation.
Unless the government doesn't want to claim that they have this technology.
They'd rather claim that there are aliens.
That way they can keep the technology for themselves because there's an arms race internationally, likely, which is why I'm more interested in the crafts that have been found. And that, I've heard that each country has a collection of these crafts that cannot be named, and that they're all trying to understand them analyze them, and then replicate and reverse engineer the type of technology that has propelled them, which seems to be unknown to us right now.
Correct. And what Lou says is that government investigations are not like academia. So for those of us who spent any time in college or in graduate school, or honestly, even in high school or junior high school and high school feel a little bit more like the military, I think. And I went to public school and had a great time. But when you think about an academic institution, you think about an institution that thrives on different opinions, challenging opinions, things that are outside of the realms of our current understanding so that we can understand them better, and an exchange of information, specifically between disciplines and departments. In the government, there is not the same kind of free exchange of ideas and disciplines.
Before we booked this guest, before you got the book, if someone had asked you, do you believe in aliens, what would you have said?
I would have said no. I would have said, I think that there's things that we can't explain, which is, I think, a very diplomatic thing for a scientist to say. And I think I would have assumed, for some bizarre reason, that everything I needed to know, the government would tell me.
After 3 years of this podcast, you would have thought that?
Oh, about this topic, this is one of those that I think many people kind of shelve in a part of their psyche that does not get, broken open.
But is like the government is going to tell me what I need to know is like the same as the government's food pyramid is like for optimal health?
No. I think, look, I also don't want to paint with this like global brush of like, I don't believe in anything that the government says and I can't trust anything. I think that's too broad of a brush for me. But I'm
not suggesting that.
Let's keep it, let's just keep it to aliens. Just keep it small.
Well, they signed legislation that says that we need to be accountable for the money that's being spent.
Correct.
And that programs that people don't know about should be.
Why is everyone not talking about this like all the time?
I think a lot of people are.
What Lou says is that the government ignores things that they can't explain until it comes to the point that they cannot ignore them anymore. And his choice, to put his own life at risk, his choice was to reveal something that he does not believe can be ignored anymore on a national scale and on a global scale.
I think a lot of people ignore things they can't explain. It's just like, what are those muddy footprints? I don't really want to know.
They were your footprints. You forgot that you had stepped in mud and that you stood in your own kitchen with muddy footprints.
I was talking about his analogy. If you found muddy footprints, people don't know the story of when I went into my kitchen and I saw these strange footprints. And I was like, who was in the kitchen?
Sent me a photo. It's very suspicious.
I was very suspicious. And then Mayim's like, your shoe.
I was like, the treads look like those shoes that I hate that you wear. I kept putting my skeptical hat on, throughout. And like...
Isn't that just your normal hat?
No, I'm saying that like, even when he was saying things that I'm like, oh, that's like a thing, right? I kept thinking, I think this is just a facet of my personality. Like I'm always afraid that we're going to say something or that I'm going to say something or that I'm going to exist in a way that like makes people be like, but you're fundamentally wrong and you're stupid and you're delusional. And that's poppycock, right? That's an old-fashioned word for BS. And so throughout him, like whenever he's talking, like I just keep hearing like, for some people it's their mom or their dad's voice. For some people it's their ex-husband or an ex-girlfriend. For some people it's their current spouse, their children. Like there's always people who are going to say, this is crazy. This is delusional. There has to be an explanation. And my favorite piece of